What you're seeing here is a 10 dB reduction of the peak at 36 Hertz and nearly a second of the RT60 decay time at that frequency. And all that from a tube the size of a trash can. Hey, what's up? It's Jesko from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. And over the past 2 years, I've been extensively testing the PSI AVAA C214 active bass traps across 10 different studios, including my own, to finally answer the question if they work, how they work, and if they are worth your hard-earned money. The PSI AVAA is the only commercially available, fully automatic active bass absorber available today, a technology so unique they had to actually invent their own sensor just to measure it, because nothing out there could. And today I'm going to give you my comprehensive review of the PSI AVAA C214. We're going to look at before and after measurements across all these 10 studios, and we're going to hear from the actual producers and mixers who tested them to see if the technical data, the measurements, actually line up with their subjective impressions and how it impacted their workflow. Now quickly, 3 things before we get started. First off, if you are interested in picking up an AVAA or 2 after watching this video, I've provided a link for you in the description. Purchasing through that link supports what I do here at Acoustics Insider at no extra cost to you. So if you are interested in this technology, this is one of the best ways to support the channel. Second, if you want to go on a proper deep dive on how this technology works and how it was developed, I actually recorded a fantastic interview with Yvon Becher, the R&D manager of PSI Audio. We talked about how the technology actually works, why prototypes kept failing even though the theory was perfect, and what the future of active absorption holds. It's fascinating. I'll also link that in the description, and you can find it in the card as well. And third, I decided to actually make the measurement data and the survey data that I collected on all these 10 rooms available for you to download completely for free. So if you want to check out the details of the measurements, I'll also link that in the description. At this point, I want to say a huge thank you to PSI Audio for lending me these units, in particular Fabrice and Yvon for all their help. I mean, it did take me 2 years, and they simply trusted me with schlepping 7K worth of their equipment through 10 studios. So again, thank you to PSI Audio, and then also Audiowerk here in Germany, in particular Jan and Uwe, for making all the logistics work and making this a really seamless process. So I did not pay for these units, and I did have to send them back, but suffice it to say that everything you see in this video, everything that I explain, all the data are my own without any involvement from PSI. All right, that said, here's what we'll cover in this video. First of all, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how the AVAA actually works. I'll show you my testing methodology, including how to actually set up the AVAAs in your room. And then we're going to go on a deep dive in 3 of the most particularly interesting cases that I measured. So we're going to look at what potentially best results are, average results are, and also a failure case, so you can really see when these work, how they work, and in what instances you might want to look at another solution first. Then we're going to go through the remaining 7 studios. I'm just going to give you kind of a summary, but there are some finer details in there and some really interesting revelations that are definitely worth understanding and knowing if you're going to be using these units in your studio. We're going to look at how much just 1 unit does in comparison to 2, what the deal is with using these units in combination with room correction software like SoundID or Trinnov. Finally, I'm going to give you my verdict and my recommendation on when you should be looking at the PSI AVAAs to control the low end in your studio. So just in case you haven't actually come across PSI Audio and the AVAA bass absorbers yet, here's how they basically work. It's a cylinder about 65 centimeters high, and you basically put it in a high pressure zone of a particular room mode frequency that you're trying to absorb. The unit then picks up the sound pressure at that location with a microphone, and through some complicated maths, it then drives two transducers, two speakers basically, in such a way that the impedance of the surrounding air is reduced so much that basically the unit and the surrounding area become a window, if you will, through which the sound then escapes. The operating range is given between 15 hertz and 160 hertz. So this is really a sub-bass to bass absorber. And PSI claim that it's the equivalent to passive absorption of 45 times the same size as the unit itself. Now, of course, this is interesting to home studios because absorbing below 50 or 40 hertz and down to even 20 hertz is basically practically impossible because you'd need porous absorption at least, 60 centimeters, maybe more, 2 to 3 feet deep. And of course, in most home studio rooms, you basically physically can't fit that much absorption. But PSI claim that they can do the same in a tube about 65 centimeters tall and 21 centimeters in diameter. So the question I really want to answer is, does this actually work? And is it worth the roughly 3,300 euros or dollars per unit? So to figure that out, I basically took them to 10 different studios. I did before and after measurements with Room EQ Wizard to look at obviously the changes in the frequency response, to look at the waterfall plot, but most importantly also the RT60 decay times of individual room modes to see just how much performance we're getting out of these units. I also interviewed the participants who used these studios, first of all, to see what their room and their low end in particular was like before they got the units, and then with the units. And I got them to rate the improvement, the subjective improvement in the low-end response in their rooms. Now, setting up the AVAAs basically followed the same procedure every time. So I measured the room without the AVAAs at the listening position first. We identified which room modes were kind of the most offending in the overall response. We then played some sine waves using the generator in Room EQ Wizard at the particular frequencies that we selected to then find where in the room at the positions that were available we got the most sound pressure. Then I placed the units there, I set the gain all the way to the maximum, and then we measured the response again at the listening position to document the change. Now in some cases the units will then go into self-resonance. So basically, it's just a feedback loop that gets created because the microphone is so close to the speaker. And in that case, we reduced the gain step by step until the point where this didn't happen anymore. But in most cases, the gain was basically on its max setting, apart from the odd room here or there. And here are the 10 studios that I tested. They range kind of from minimally treated through partially treated all the way up to well treated. We had various speakers from Genelec, Adam, Neumann, Head, and Amphion, and various room sizes as well, although most of them were just your standard rectangle. We did have one L-shaped room, but that's pretty much it. The owners of the studio basically had them for an entire month to really get into what it's like working with these units. And of course, in every case, we used 2 PSI AVAAs for the test. Okay, so the first room I want to show you is Mateo's room. So as you can tell, this is a fairly small basement room, roughly kind of 3.5 by 4 meters, low ceilings. It had some basic treatment with some kind of DIY 10 centimeter Rockwool absorbers and some Basotec panels and smaller super chunk style bass traps in the corners. The speakers were Neumann KH120, and we ended up placing the AVAAs in the back of the room, in the left and right corners on top of the small super chunks, in particular to attack this nasty standing wave at 36 hertz. And this reflected in how Mateo rated his low end before we got the PSIs in there. He basically said that it was undefined and imprecise, and that he had some frequencies sticking out. No surprise there. But that basically led him having to go to other studios to judge the low end and everything below around 150 hertz. Now, looking at the actual measurements, here's what we're seeing. First of all, here's a before and after of the left speaker and a before and after of the right speaker. Obviously, the red is before and the green is after. And you can really tell how that 36 hertz peak basically disappeared completely. It's much stronger in the left speaker than it is in the right speaker, but still, even in the right speaker, to be honest, that's an impressive result. In fact, that's a reduction of 10 dB at that frequency, so going from the peak to where the green line sits now at 36 hertz. But here's the really impressive bit, right? So now looking at the waterfall plot, and I've zoomed into the range up to only about 1 kilohertz, and you can really see what that 36 hertz room mode does before we put the PSIs in. And here it is with the PSIs. So when looking at the RT60 decay time, and I'm not going to show that to you right here now, but that's a reduction of just over 1 second for this standing wave to decay by 60 decibels, down to 0.25 seconds. That is a ridiculous result. And in fact, that equals a cut of 0.84 seconds all in all from just putting 2 of these units in the room. But going back to the frequency response, something else that I want you to be aware of is what happened here at around 144 hertz, because it seems like the frequency response actually got worse. And I think this is something to be aware of. To be honest, this isn't a problem with the PSIs. This is just generally what happens, or what can happen, as you start putting treatment in the room and removing or damping certain acoustic effects. Basically what's happening here is that there used to be a reflection or a room mode, maybe even at this high frequency, that actually had a peak. Once that standing wave was damped or the reflection was cut, that revealed a dip that was potentially caused by a different reflection or room mode, right? So obviously, just so you understand, if you continue on with the treatment process even further, then you would also deal with this particular reflection that is causing the dip now, and the energy would come back up again. But this is just something that happens as you start removing certain acoustic effects that then reveal other issues that you haven't dealt with. And that's basically what we're seeing here. Now, in terms of rating the improvement, Mateo actually gave this a 7 up from 5. So basically rating it 5 would have been no change, and then up to 10 is the improvement. If he had given it a number below 5, it would have actually made the room worse. But so he basically gave it a 7. And that goes along with his subjective impression. He said the low end was more tangible, more precise, sharper defined, and spatially clearer. He also said that it made level adjustments easier and more precise as well. And the biggest benefit really is that he noticed that he didn't have to go to other rooms anymore to judge the low end. So what can we take away from this? Well, first of all, we can tell just how much impact 2 PSI AVAAs can have in a kind of minimally treated room like this, right? So we're seeing extremely impressive reductions in the decay time, and some improvement, in this case actually pretty good improvement, goes along with that in the frequency response. But it is basically limited to the actual room modes that you're targeting. We're not seeing an overall flattening across the entire band that the PSI AVAAs potentially deal with, right? So 15 to 160 hertz. It reacts to the pressure maxima of the particular frequencies that you're targeting, and it does its thing on those frequencies exactly, and potentially any other frequencies that also have high pressure zones in the area where the unit is placed. And just like any other type of treatment, it can reveal other issues that you haven't dealt with yet. Next up, let's look at Pascal's room. So this is an even smaller room, roughly 3.5 by 2.5 meters with 2.2 meter ceilings. But it's much better treated. So he has 3 40-centimeter deep corner bass traps, a ceiling cloud 10 centimeters deep with a 10 centimeter air gap, and multiple panels on the walls. The speakers he used were the Neumann KH310s, and he uses SoundID SonarWorks for room correction. His main problem before we installed the AVAAs was that he had a relatively small sweet spot, and in the frequency response there was a major dip at around 110 Hertz that was probably caused by either speaker boundary interference or maybe also in combination with a floor reflection, potentially. He described himself that he wished the low end was a bit more defined and balanced, and in particular in the lowest end of the spectrum. So here are the results from the measurements. And in particular, let's look at the frequency response again first, here from the left speaker. And what we can see is that he actually gains some energy at the lowest frequencies at around sort of 30 to 40 Hertz, but maybe only about 3 dB in total. There's also some reduction in peaks, in particular that one at around 85, 86 Hertz, and the dip at 110 Hertz actually got better as well. Here's the result from the right speaker. And again, we can see that improvement in the lowest part of the spectrum, so 30 to 40 Hertz, but also an increased dip, if you will, at around 66, 67 Hertz, again, probably caused by the removal of a certain accentuation, which revealed another issue that wasn't actually dealt with. So all in all, we're looking at an improvement of maybe somewhere between 1 and 3 decibels, both positive and negative, depending on the exact frequency. But now looking at the waterfall plot, here's where things get really interesting. Now, it might not look like much, and that's because it's actually quite difficult to really nail down how long the RT60 decay time of a certain room mode is, especially in a room like this that is already particularly well treated. But if we look at this room mode at 34 Hertz, we actually went from 1.4 seconds down to 0.4 seconds. So that's an improvement of just over 1 second in the measured RT60 decay time. Again, it might not actually look like that much here in the waterfall plot, but if we really measure the individual decay time of that particular room mode, that's kind of the best number that I could come up with. And that reflected in his subjective impression as well. Again, he rated the improvement as a 7, up from 5, where 5 is no change. And he said, the low end sounded a bit more even, but the biggest improvement was probably how tight the low end got, given the reduction in the reverberation time on certain resonance frequencies in the room. This led to more precise decay times on kicks and overall less mud on the low end. I think the biggest difference was that I was able to make decisions more confidently when mixing the low end, having to check less on headphones. Since my room was already treated, there wasn't a night and day difference, but it was by all means noticeable, and the AVAAs led to a nicer mixing and listening experience. And this gives us one of the key insights, in my opinion, about how the AVAAs work. They are mainly about reducing the decay time of particular room modes, and not so much to improve the frequency response. You're going to see an equivalent improvement in the frequency response as well, but because they work so targeted, we really only see that improvement at those particular frequencies. And I mentioned before that Pascal also uses SoundID SonarWorks, so room correction. And in this instance, we can see why that's still useful, because room correction, basically speaker EQ, is just about shaping the tonal balance, but not about actually improving the decay time in the room. So we can see the AVAAs as actual acoustic treatment. They work perfectly well in conjunction with room correction, where you basically do the best you can with acoustic treatment, including the AVAAs, and then you run your room correction on top of that. All right, let's move on to Lisa's room, because I also want to show you under what circumstances you can really only expect very limited results. So Lisa's room is also pretty much a rectangle. It's a fairly big room, 3.6 by 6.5 meters with 3.4 meter ceiling height. It's pretty well treated with 24 16 centimeter absorbers strutting both the corners and on the walls. Speakers are the Head Type 07 MK1s, and the critical issue with this room really is the window behind the speakers. Now, Lisa's problem was basically the following. She said, I need to move around the room in order to judge it. My impression is that it is both too weak and too strong. It's basically overall unbalanced in the room. And here's why. So again, starting with the frequency response. Here is the left speaker. And as we can tell, we have this massive peak at just over 50 hertz with a very sudden and steep drop of energy on both sides of it, so both below and above. So this is a really very strong room mode that plays into an overall kind of suck out below 100 hertz. Here we can see the same thing happening in the right speaker, although it's not quite as strong. And in this case, although we see a significant improvement in the frequency response with the AVAAs, it's just not enough to recover energy that basically wasn't there in the first place. Yeah, so we do see a reduction of maybe 4 decibels of this massive peak at just over 50 hertz. And we also see some energy kind of coming back at these frequencies somewhere between 60 and 70 hertz. But below that massive peak at 50 something hertz, we're still not gaining any energy. In fact, we're losing some energy, even though it's just maybe a decibel or 2. And again, we can see the same in the right speaker. Although that peak didn't change, it just kind of shifted in frequency. We did lose energy at basically the frequencies between 80 and 100 hertz and below around 40 hertz. Although also, we can see that very narrow dip at 70 hertz improving. And here's what that looks like in the waterfall plot. Yeah, so that particular room mode at just over 50 hertz, 52 hertz is very prominent. And with the AVAAs, it actually got reduced quite a bit. In fact, we see a reduction down to about 0.26 seconds from about 0.3 seconds. So there's a marginal improvement, and we can see this in both speakers. And although it looks impressive, it really just wasn't enough to actually improve the low end to a point where we could call this issue fixed. And so Lisa also only gave this a subjective improvement of maybe 1 point, so up to 6 from 5, again 5 being no change. She said there is a slight difference when doing A/B comparisons with and without the units, but it just wasn't enough to actually have any major impact on the way the low end is heard in the room. Instead, the solution here was actually adding a subwoofer. Because at that close proximity, you can recreate some of that energy, even though the windows basically let all that energy out. And so by using a subwoofer, you can get some of that energy back locally, kind of before it exits the window, if you will. But so in this case, a subwoofer was the solution and not actually the PSI AVAAs. And that's really what we can take away from this particular example. If there isn't any sound pressure in the first place, the AVAAs can't recreate that somehow. It needs that sound pressure to be able to absorb it. And if it's not there in the first place, it's just not going to work. And this also aligns with how PSI describes the functionality of this unit. They basically say it works roughly 80% of the time. And that is because it can't fix potentially structural issues in the actual room. If there are fundamental construction problems, you need to fix those first in order for there to be any sound pressure that the AVAAs can actually work with. All right, let's move on to the remaining 7 studios. And I'm just going to give you a quick summary, including some of the things that stood out, including what happened in my room. So first up, this is Alex's room. It's actually decently treated. And Alex gave the improvement a rating of 8, the actual highest score in my entire test. So again, up from 5 being no change. And he said the low end became a lot tighter with the ringing being much shorter. It's like soothe for your room, he says. Interestingly, he also said that it improved his vocal recordings because basically he had to do less low-mid processing because the recordings were that much cleaner. So something to note here, in particular in the frequency response, is that we're actually seeing up to -5 decibels of improvement at certain frequencies. And we can again see this revealing effect happening that I talked about before, where basically 2 effects lie on top of each other and then removing one actually reveals the other. Next up, we have Elmar's room. Again, pretty well treated, but he only gave the improvement a subjective rating of 7. And this is really funny because the measurements definitely showed an improvement, but here the whole workflow aspect comes in because Emma actually relies on RTA metering quite heavily to judge what's going on in the low end. And he said that he didn't miss the PSIs when they were gone. So basically they were a nice to have, not a need to have for his specific workflow. Looking at the measurements, one thing that stands out is this dip widening at 110 Hertz and the actual suppression that we got of the room mode at 62 Hertz. Moving on to Ramon's room, and again, this one is really well treated. It's a big room, but he also gave the improvement a subjective rating of 7 because it was more contained and balanced with less interference. One thing in particular to note in the measurements is this 15 decibel change that we can see at 116 Hertz. And this is probably a back corner reflection that we removed because that's actually where we placed one of the units. Also interesting is that considering the decay time at 24 Hertz, we didn't actually see any shortening, but we did see some evening out in the frequency response. Okay, moving on to Oscar's room, again, pretty well treated. And he gave the subjective improvement a rating of 7, which he then actually improved up to 8 in hindsight. So at the top of the rating in this case, because he had to use less processing and that made everything better. And the confidence of actually hearing the low end also made things better. Now, because Oscar mainly produces and mixes, he also had the interesting insight that it made sample selection much easier during production. Next up, Marcus, with a decently treated room, and again, a subjective rating of 7, up from 5. He actually combined the PSI treatment with IK Multimedia's ARC room correction. And in his particular case, he noted that the PSIs basically stopped the desk vibrating at particular frequencies. And he was probably the saddest of all my contestants when I removed the AVAAs. He said that he had a tear in his eyes. Now, second to last, Leonard's room. This was probably the least treated room with just some very basic 5 centimeter panels here or there, and the smaller speakers in the bunch as well with the Genelec 8010 APs. He also gave the improvement a subjective rating of 7 up from 5. And in particular, he noted that it was surprising that he got more low-end B880 Hertz, which wasn't something that he was expecting. But again, looking at the frequency response, we can actually see dips that got created at 67 and 90 Hertz where there weren't any before. Finally, my own room, which I would say is decently treated, and I saw a very moderate improvement really. The most interesting part to me, looking at the frequency response, is that we see this reduction of these dips at 62 and 65 Hertz. Now, I narrowed this down to speaker boundary interference coming from some cabinets which are down on the floor beside the speakers, but I didn't expect that to happen. On average, I saw an improvement of about 0.2 seconds in the decay time at the frequencies that I targeted. And personally, I wouldn't keep the PSIs. The benefit just isn't worth the cost in my already decently well-treated room. At this point, you might be wondering, okay, this is what happens with 2 units, but what actually is the difference to just using 1? So let me just pick out a few examples here, starting with Mateo's room again. So we're just going to look at the waterfall plot to see a change or the change that you can expect. So here's what that lowest room mode looks like without the PSIs. Here it is with just the 1 PSI active in the back right corner of the room. And then finally, both of them together. Here's another example. So this is again from Oscar's room. And so this is what the low end looked like before introducing the PSIs. Here it is with 1 PSI active in the back of the room, and then finally with both of them together. And the trend was basically the same in all the rooms where I measured the single unit performance versus both of them active. And in a nutshell, it just shows that with each additional unit, you get an additional improvement. In some cases, one position worked slightly better than the other, but in all cases, both together worked better than just using one. And so that's really also my recommendation when you're thinking about getting these, I would plan to simply get 2 right from the start. You start by just introducing one and experiment with the position to get as much out of it as possible. Then you introduce the next one and you do the same, once again, experimenting with positioning to get the most out of that one. And then you can expect that both of them together will give you the best result. So let's talk numbers altogether. What can you actually expect when we average out all these results? So first of all, you can expect an RT60 decay improvement on the primary room modes that you're attacking of, on average, 0.5 seconds with 2 units, obviously. That's a pretty good result, considering that they work down to potentially 15 Hertz. And as we saw in the best cases, this could be up to 0.7, maybe up to a full second of reduction with just 2 units. Now, in terms of frequency response improvements, it's not quite as strong. On occasion, you can expect a peak to maybe be reduced by up to 10 decibels, but it's more in the range of 1 to maybe 5 decibels, on average more like 2 or 3 dB improvements on reducing peaks or bringing up dips. In terms of the subjective improvements, 7 out of 9 basically rated the improvement at a 7, up from 5, again 5 being no change. 2 basically rated the improvement with an 8, and 1 limited case saw basically no improvement, maybe a 6 up from 5, but the structural limitations were just too great and the PSIs just couldn't really fix any issues in this particular room. All in all, I was really impressed with these units because getting absorption below 50 Hertz at this footprint really is remarkable. And I found that it can actually take care of speaker boundary interference issues if you place them correctly. This isn't actually something that I expected to see. And again, the small footprint really is one of a kind. I mean, just compare a 64 times 21 centimeter diameter tube with the potentially 60 centimeter plus deep absorption that you would need to get a similar effect from porous absorption. But it's still important to understand that these are expensive units. At around 3,300 euros or dollars per unit, they are not cheap. And as you can tell, 2 units will give you a decent improvement, but at that stage, we still can't really say full low-end control. You'd probably need more like 4 or more units than that. It's also really important to not expect more from them than what they are. These are bass absorbers. That's it. They absorb bass. They are no substitute for speaker calibration, potentially upgrading your speakers if you need to, or structural issues with your room, as we saw in Lisa's example. They can also potentially reveal issues instead of solving them. But this isn't, like I said, the fault of the PSIs. This is just what potentially happens with bass absorption. And like I said, these are bass absorbers. If you selectively remove or reduce particular acoustic effects, some others might pop up that you just haven't dealt with yet. And then we also typically see some diminishing returns, particularly in very well-treated rooms. Basically, if there is no more energy to work with, or you can't place them where they need to go because you already have substantial passive treatment there, then they just can't play their cards properly, and so they end up being less effective. So, should you get the PSI AVAA C214 for your room? Well, if you're planning from scratch, I still think that passive acoustic treatment, and in particular planning the room as a full system, is still your answer. And the reason is simple. If you can plan holistically, you can actually deal with all the acoustic effects happening in your room and not just targeted at very particular low frequencies. That said, if you already have a room and you're struggling with your low end, the traditional answer to fixing the low end would have been that you also need to start from scratch and actually go through all the individual steps. So positioning, acoustic treatment, and then potentially room correction. But if you have the money to spend, there now is another solution to fix your low end without sacrificing a ton of space, and it is called the PSI AVAA C214. So in summary, the PSI AVAAs are technically impressive and they genuinely work, but it is not magic. It's definitely not for everyone. I think they work best for existing rooms where passive treatment physically just can't reach low enough. And they work worst in rooms where you have structural issues that are causing your low-end problems. My testing data from these 10 rooms confirms you can basically see an average improvement of around 0.5 seconds of decay time at the most offending room mode frequencies. And on average, you'll see a subjective improvement of around 7 up from 5. All right, this has been a long one. As always, let's now get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.